Millionaire freezes when orphan black girl shouts 4 words, then that changes everything her life. In this heartwarming video, we dive into a remarkable story that will tug at your heartstrings. A wealthy man is stopped in his tracks by a young orphan black girl who shouts 4 simple yet powerful words. If you're excited about this story, please let us know. If you enjoyed the video, please press 1. If not, press 0. Your feedback has inspired me to collect more uplifting and meaningful stories.
A young girl in simple clothes approached the millionaire in a bustling restaurant and uttered 5 urgent words. The man froze, his world shifting in an instant, and without hesitation, he stood to help. "My mom needs help. Now." The child's voice cut through the refined hum of the restaurant like a discordant note in a symphony. Alexander Hale, accustomed to being untouchable in his world of contracts and figures, lifted his eyes from the stack of documents in front of him. The girl standing before him couldn't have been more than 9 or 10 years old. Her simple clothes, a faded jacket and worn-out sneakers, clashed starkly with the pristine white tablecloths and crystal glasses surrounding them. But that wasn't what unsettled him. It was her eyes, large, fixed, carrying a weight of urgency he couldn't ignore. He leaned back in his chair, studying her with the patience of someone used to evaluating people. "And why did you come to me?" "Because no one else listened," she answered without hesitation, her voice as firm as a command. Her small hands were clenched into fists, as though gathering the courage to speak had been her greatest battle. "They said they were busy. You don't look busy." Alexander glanced at the papers in front of him, then back at her. He could feel the piercing gazes of other diners boring into his back, as if the very act of her addressing him was a scandal. He didn't like being the center of attention, especially when he didn't understand what was happening. "Who are you?" he finally asked, breaking the heavy silence between them. "My name is Ella Brooks." She straightened her small shoulders, as if the name were a declaration of strength rather than a mere detail. "And my mom is at home. She can't get up. She's sick. Have you called an ambulance?" He pulled his phone from his pocket, more as a stalling tactic than because he actually knew what to do. Ella shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. "They came yesterday. Said they couldn't do anything without money. You have money." The bluntness of her statement caught Alexander off guard. He remained silent for a moment, watching her as if she were a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. "And how do you know you can trust me?" Ella crossed her arms. "I don't, but you're here. That's more than anyone else." There was something painfully true in her words. Alexander sighed, setting his pen down on the table. "Fine, show me where she is." Ella didn't smile or thank him. She simply nodded, turned on her heel and began walking toward the exit. Alexander grabbed his coat, his wallet, and followed, feeling the weight of the stairs on his back. When they stepped into the cold night air, he finally broke the silence between them. "How old are you?" he asked, trying to gauge the gravity of the situation through her. "9, Ella replied without looking back, her steps quick and determined, like someone far older. "Do you always do this? Approach strangers asking for help?" She stopped abruptly, turning to face him. "Only when my mom is dying." Her words hit him like a punch to the stomach. Alexander said nothing as Ella resumed walking, faster now, as though afraid he might change his mind. She led him through streets that grew darker with every turn, pulling him further from the comfort of his insulated world. The smell of damp asphalt and garbage grew stronger as they approached a worn-down building with walls scarred by time. "This is it," Ella said, pushing open the rusted door with effort. The hallway was dimly lit, and Alexander noticed how the concrete floor seemed to swallow the light rather than reflect it. Ella led him up narrow, creaking stairs, stopping finally at a door with peeling wood and a broken handle. "She's in here," she said, her voice lower now. When she opened the door, Alexander felt the impact of the smell before he saw anything. It was a mix of mold, sweat, and something sickly sweet he couldn't identify. In the center of the small room, on a worn-out mattress on the floor, lay a woman. She didn't move. She's been like this since yesterday, Ella said, her voice breaking for the first time. I tried. I don't know what else to do. Alexander stood frozen for a moment, his instincts scrambling to catch up with the gravity of the scene. He pulled out his phone, dialing emergency services with the efficiency that came naturally to him. They'll be here in minutes, he said, crouching down to check the woman's pulse. It was faint, too faint. He looked at Ella, who was now kneeling beside her mother, holding the woman's pale hand. You've done everything you could, Alexander said, unsure if the words would mean anything. They'll help now. Ella didn't respond. Her eyes stayed on her mother, but there was something in her expression, a hollowness, that told Alexander she already knew what he hadn't yet said. The ambulance arrived in minutes, though it felt like hours. The flashing red lights painted the walls of the dark apartment, casting eerie shadows over the worn furniture and cracked plaster. 2 paramedics rushed inside, their professional demeanor clashing with the despair that hung thick in the air. Over here, Alexander said, his voice steadier than he felt. He stepped aside as the paramedics knelt beside the motionless woman on the mattress. Ella stood a few feet away, her small frame trembling, though her face remained unreadable. Alexander noticed how tightly she gripped the edge of her jacket, her knuckles turning white. One of the paramedics, a man in his early 40s with a weary face, checked the woman's pulse and glanced at his colleague. It was a fleeting look, but Alexander caught it, a silent exchange that spoke volumes. Is she? Ella's voice cracked, breaking the suffocating silence. The paramedic turned to her, his expression softening. We'll do everything we can, he said, though his tone betrayed the truth. Alexander clenched his jaw. He had seen enough negotiations and backroom deals to recognize when someone was trying to soften a blow. How bad is it? He asked, his tone firm. The paramedic hesitated before answering. She's unresponsive. It may have been too long. Ella's eyes darted between them, her breathing shallow and quick. Without thinking, Alexander moved closer to her, placing a hand on her shoulder. She flinched but didn't pull away entirely. Ella, he said softly, crouching down to her level. They're going to do what they can, okay? She nodded, but her eyes stayed locked on her mother, as if willing her to move, to give any sign of life. The paramedics worked quickly, placing the woman on a stretcher and attaching monitors that beeped steadily, though too slowly. As they prepared to wheel her out, the paramedic turned back to Alexander. We'll take her to St. Mary's. Are you family? Alexander hesitated, the weight of the question pressing on him. Before he could answer, Ella spoke up. She's my mum, she said, her voice small but firm. The paramedic gave a quick nod. She'll need to come with us. Are you her guardian? Alexander glanced at Ella, who was staring at him now, her eyes wide with unspoken pleading. He made the decision in an instant. I'll go with her. They rode to the hospital in silence. Alexander sat across from Ella in the ambulance, the space too cramped and the air too heavy. Ella sat close to the stretcher, her small hand resting on her mother's arm. Alexander couldn't help but notice how her fingers barely wrapped around the woman's wrist. The sight struck him harder than he expected. At the hospital, things moved quickly. Doctors took over, and Alexander found himself in a waiting room that smelled of antiseptic and coffee that had been left too long on the burner. Ella sat next to him, silent and still, staring at the floor. He didn't know what to say. What did one say to a child in this situation? After what felt like an eternity, a doctor approached. Alexander stood as the man removed his mask, his face grim. I'm sorry, he said simply. She didn't make it. Alexander felt a pang in his chest, though he barely knew the woman. He glanced at Ella, expecting an outburst of tears or a cry of denial. Instead, she sat frozen, her expression blank. It was the kind of stillness he had only seen in people who had experienced profound loss before, people who had learned to brace for pain. Ella, he began, but she stood abruptly, her small hands clenched into fists at her sides. Can I see her? She asked, her voice steady but void of emotion. The doctor hesitated but nodded. "Of course. Follow me." Alexander followed them down the hall, his footsteps echoing in the sterile corridor. When they entered the room, Ella approached the bed slowly, as if each step required more effort than the last. Her mother lay there, peaceful in a way that felt cruelly deceptive. Ella reached out and touched her mother's hand, her fingers trembling. "I tried," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I tried everything." Alexander stayed back, giving her space, but ready to step in if needed. He watched as she stood there, her shoulders shaking slightly. She didn't cry, not the way he expected. Instead, her pain seemed to seep out in the silence, filling the room like a thick fog. When they left the hospital, it was nearly dawn. The sky was a pale grey, the first hints of sunlight creeping over the horizon. Alexander stood on the sidewalk with Ella beside him, her small frame seeming even smaller in the faint morning light. "What now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Alexander looked down at her, his mind racing. He had no answers, no plans. All he knew was that he couldn't leave her. Not here, not now. "You'll come with me," he said finally, his voice steady. She looked up at him, her face unreadable. "Why?" "Because I can't walk away," he thought, but he didn't say it. Instead, he simply replied, "Because you shouldn't be alone." Ella didn't argue. She simply nodded, as if accepting his words as a temporary truth. Together, they began walking toward his car, the city waking up around them. Alexander glanced at her, realizing that this was only the beginning of something far more complicated than he had ever imagined. Alexander's sleek black car hummed quietly as it navigated through the winding streets toward his home. Ella sat in the passenger seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She hadn't spoken a word since they left the hospital. The streetlights flickered through the windows, casting fleeting shadows on her face, which was unreadable, like a wall had gone up around her. Alexander stole a glance at her, unsure of what to say. His life was built on control of his business, his image, his future, but nothing about this situation fit into the careful compartments he had constructed for himself. He cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "We're almost there." Ella didn't respond. Her gaze was fixed out the window, staring at the passing buildings without really seeing them. He wasn't sure if she had even heard him. When they arrived at his mansion, the gates opened smoothly, revealing a sprawling estate illuminated by soft exterior lights. The perfectly manicured lawns and towering columns were a stark contrast to the crumbling apartment Ella had called home. Alexander parked the car and stepped out, pausing to wait for Ella. She hesitated before opening the door, her small figure dwarfed by the grandeur of the place. "This is your house?" she asked, finally breaking her silence. Her tone wasn't curious, just flat, as though the opulence around her barely registered. "Yes," Alexander replied, unsure of how else to respond. He led her up the stone steps and through the grand entrance. The foyer was immaculate, with marble floors that gleamed under a massive crystal chandelier. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh flowers, though it felt cold, sterile, even. Ella stepped inside, her shoes making soft, scuffing sounds against the floor. Her eyes darted around, taking in the pristine furniture, the towering ceilings, and the artwork on the walls. It wasn't awe that crossed her face, but something closer to discomfort. "You can stay here for now," Alexander said, his voice steady but awkward, "until we figure out the next steps." "Where am I supposed to sleep?" she asked, her voice sharp. There was no hostility, just the bluntness of a child who had no energy left for niceties. "I'll show you," he said, gesturing for her to follow. He led her down a hallway to a guest room. It was large, with a king-sized bed covered in a plush white comforter, a matching set of polished wooden furniture, and a view of the expansive backyard through tall windows. Ella stood in the doorway, staring at the room as if it were a museum exhibit. "This is too much," she muttered under her breath, though she stepped inside anyway. She dropped her small backpack, worn and frayed, onto the floor near the bed, but didn't sit. Instead, she wandered to the window, staring out at the darkened yard. Alexander watched her from the doorway, unsure of whether to say something or leave her alone. "If you need anything, my room is down the hall," he offered. Ella turned to face him, her expression guarded. "Why are you doing this?" The question caught him off guard. He had been asking himself the same thing. "Because you don't have anyone else right now," he said simply. It was the only answer he could give. She didn't reply, just turned back to the window. Taking that as his cue to leave, Alexander stepped out of the room, closing the door softly behind him. As he walked back to his own room, he couldn't shake the image of her standing there, small and alone in a house too big for her. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Sleep didn't come. Alexander lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying the events of the day. He had taken on employees, investors, and multi-million-dollar deals without breaking a sweat. Yet the responsibility of one small girl felt heavier than all of it combined. The next morning, Alexander found Ella in the living room. She was standing by the grand piano, her fingers hovering just above the keys but not pressing down. She seemed lost in thought, her expression softer than it had been the night before. "You play?" he asked, stepping into the room. Ella flinched slightly, pulling her hand back as though she'd been caught doing something wrong. "I used to. My mom taught me." "She must have been good," Alexander said, approaching the piano. "You can play if you want. It's here for a reason." Ella hesitated, her eyes darting between him and the piano. Finally, she sat down on the bench, her small hands resting lightly on the keys. She pressed a few notes tentatively, the sound echoing through the large room. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, her hands moved with more confidence, piecing together a melody that was soft but haunting. Alexander stood silently, watching her. The music filled the space in a way nothing else ever had. For the first time, the house didn't feel so cold. When she finished, Ella sat still, her fingers lingering on the keys. "My mom used to sing to it," she said quietly. "I don't remember all the words." "It was beautiful," Alexander said, and he meant it. He didn't miss the way her shoulders relaxed slightly at the compliment. For the first time, he saw something in her that hadn't been there before, something fragile, but alive. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was a step. The knock on the door echoed through the vast expanse of Alexander's mansion. It was sharp and deliberate, cutting through the quiet morning air. Ella, seated at the grand piano in the living room, stopped playing abruptly, her hands freezing over the keys. She glanced at Alexander, who was standing by the window with a coffee cup in hand, a frown already forming on his face. "Stay here," he said softly, setting his mug down and heading toward the door. When Alexander opened it, he was met with the stern but professional gaze of a woman in her early 50s. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back into a no-nonsense bun, and she held a leather satchel tucked neatly under one arm. Her tailored blazer and the badge clipped to her chest told Alexander everything he needed to know before she even introduced herself. "Mr. Hale, I presume?" she asked, her tone polite but clipped. "Yes," he replied, his own tone neutral. "And you are?" "Margaret Ellis, social worker with the Department of Child Welfare," she said, offering a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm here to discuss the welfare of Ella Brooks." Alexander's jaw tightened. He stepped aside to let her in, gesturing toward the sitting room. "Please, come in." Margaret walked inside, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. She surveyed the house with a quick but thorough glance, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Alexander led her to a plush armchair and took a seat across from her. He felt the weight of her scrutiny, the way she seemed to be mentally cataloguing every detail about him and his home. "Before we proceed, let me clarify why I'm here," Margaret began, pulling a folder from her satchel. "Ella's mother's passing has left her without a legal guardian. As per protocol, we are required to place her in the foster care system unless there is a verified family member or legal custodian willing and able to care for her. Alexander leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "She's staying here with me." Margaret's expression didn't change. "Mr. Hale, I understand your intentions, but Ella's placement isn't something that can be decided informally. You're not related to her, nor do you have legal custody. The foster system is designed to ensure the child's well-being." "She's fine here," Alexander interrupted, his voice firm but controlled. "She's safe, she's comfortable, and she doesn't need to be uprooted again." Margaret sighed, as though she had dealt with this argument countless times before. "While I appreciate your concern, this isn't about comfort. It's about legality and ensuring that Ella is placed in an environment equipped to meet her needs." "She has everything she needs here," Alexander shot back, his frustration barely contained. "Why put her through more trauma by placing her with strangers?" Margaret studied him for a moment, her expression softening slightly. "Mr. Hale, I can see that you care about her, but these procedures exist for a reason. Ella has lost her mother. She needs stability, structure." "I'm offering her that," Alexander interrupted again, his voice rising slightly. "I can provide for her in ways no foster home can." Margaret raised a brow. "Providing financially isn't the same as raising a child. Do you have experience with children, Mr. Hale?" Alexander hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "No," he admitted, his voice quieter now, "but I'm willing to learn, and I'm not about to let her go through this alone." Margaret sighed again, closing the folder in her lap. "If you're serious about keeping Ella in your care, you'll need to petition for temporary custody. It's not an easy process, and it will require you to prove that you're capable of meeting her emotional, educational, and developmental needs." "I'll do whatever it takes," Alexander said firmly. Margaret studied him for a long moment, as if weighing his sincerity. Finally, she nodded. "Very well. I'll give you the necessary information to begin the process, but until then, Ella remains under the supervision of the department." As she stood to leave, Ella appeared in the doorway, her small frame barely visible against the grandness of the hall. Her eyes flicked between Margaret and Alexander, her expression guarded. "Ella," Margaret said gently, softening her tone. "How are you, sweetheart?" Ella didn't answer. She moved to stand closer to Alexander, her presence small but defiant. Alexander placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, a silent promise that he wouldn't let her face this alone. Margaret observed the interaction, her lips pressing into a thin line. "We'll be in touch," she said, handing Alexander a business card before heading to the door. After she left, Ella turned to Alexander, her eyes wide with unspoken fear. "Are they going to take me away?" "No," Alexander said immediately, his voice steady and certain. He crouched down to her level, meeting her gaze directly. "I won't let that happen." "You promise?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I promise," he replied, his hand tightening gently on her shoulder. "No one is going to take you away from me." Ella stared at him for a long moment before nodding, her trust in him tentative but growing. For the first time, Alexander felt the full weight of the commitment he had just made. It wasn't about money or responsibility anymore. It was about fighting for a child who had no one else. As they stood in the quiet house, Alexander's mind began racing with plans, lawyers, paperwork, whatever it would take to keep his promise. He didn't know how long the fight would last, but he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't fail her. The morning sunlight filtered through the massive windows of Alexander's mansion, casting long streaks of gold across the polished floors. Ella sat at the dining table, her small figure dwarfed by the oversized chair. She quietly picked at a slice of toast, her appetite clearly absent. Across from her, Alexander sipped his coffee, his mind preoccupied with the mountain of legal tasks ahead. He glanced at Ella, who was staring blankly at her plate. The silence between them was heavy, filled with the unspoken weight of uncertainty. Alexander cleared his throat, breaking the stillness. "Do you want more breakfast?" he asked, though he could already guess the answer. Ella shook her head without looking up. I'm fine. Fine. That word had become her shield, a default response to deflect concern. Alexander set his mug down, watching her closely. We could go out today, he suggested, trying to sound casual. Maybe get you some new clothes or anything you need. Ella finally looked up, her eyes cautious. Why? Why not? He replied, leaning back in his chair. It's about time you had some things of your own. She hesitated, as if weighing whether to trust his intentions. Okay, she said quietly. Later that day, Alexander took her to a department store downtown. Ella walked beside him, her hands tucked into her jacket pockets, her gaze darting nervously at the bustling crowds. The store was bright and overwhelming, filled with racks of colorful clothes and shelves, stacked with toys and books. Alexander watched as Ella lingered near a display of children's coats, but didn't touch anything. Pick something you like, he encouraged. Ella glanced at him, then back at the coats. I don't need anything fancy, she muttered. It doesn't have to be fancy, Alexander said, his tone softening. Just something that feels like you. Reluctantly, Ella reached for a plain grey coat, her fingers brushing the fabric hesitantly. Alexander frowned. That one's fine, he said, but how about we try a few others too? She gave him a wary look but nodded. After a little more coaxing, Ella chose a warmer coat, a few shirts, and a pair of sturdy sneakers. Alexander noticed how careful she was, never picking anything that seemed too expensive or unnecessary. It was as though she didn't want to impose, even now. As they walked toward the checkout, Ella's steps slowed near a small display of keyboards and musical instruments. She stopped, her eyes fixed on a compact electronic keyboard that was tucked neatly in a corner. Alexander followed her gaze. Do you play? He asked. Ella shrugged. I used to. We had a piano, but we had to sell it. Alexander studied her for a moment before making a decision. Let's get it. Ella's head snapped toward him, her eyes wide. No, it's too much. I don't need it. You said you used to play, Alexander said simply. Now you can again. For a moment, Ella seemed on the verge of arguing, but she stopped. Her gaze lingered on the keyboard, and Alexander saw the smallest flicker of longing in her expression. She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. Thank you. Back at the house, Ella placed the keyboard on the coffee table in the living room. She sat cross-legged on the floor, running her fingers over the keys as if reacquainting herself with an old friend. Alexander watched from a distance, not wanting to interrupt. When she began to play, the melody was hesitant at first, the notes soft and uneven. But as her confidence grew, the music flowed more smoothly, filling the room with a quiet, bittersweet tune. Alexander leaned against the doorway, struck by the emotion in her playing. It wasn't just music, it was a glimpse into her heart, a part of her she had kept hidden until now. What's that song? He asked when she finished. Ella looked up, startled. She hadn't noticed him there. It's something my mom used to sing, she said, her voice tinged with both pride and sadness. She liked to make up songs. Alexander nodded, his chest tightening. It's beautiful. Ella offered a faint smile, the first he had seen from her. It was small, barely there, but it felt like a victory. For the first time, she seemed to relax, even if only for a moment. Over the next few days, a routine began to form. Alexander, unaccustomed to having someone else in the house, found himself adjusting to the rhythm of Ella's presence. She was quiet and independent, often retreating to her room or sitting at the piano, but she no longer flinched when he spoke to her. Slowly, carefully, she began to let her guard down. One evening, Alexander entered the living room to find Ella playing the keyboard again. This time, the melody was lighter, more playful. He listened quietly, not wanting to disturb her. When she finished, she turned to him, her expression curious. Do you play anything? She asked. Alexander chuckled, shaking his head. Not a note. I was always too busy with other things. Like what? She pressed. Work, he said simply. Business. Numbers. That sounds boring, Ella said, her bluntness catching him off guard. For a moment, Alexander was taken aback. Then he laughed, a genuine deep laugh he hadn't felt in years. You're probably right. Ella smiled again, this time a little wider. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind Alexander why he was doing this. She was starting to trust him, piece by piece, and he realized how much that meant. As the days passed, Alexander found himself growing more protective of Ella. The thought of someone taking her away gnawed at him constantly. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but every time she smiled or played the keyboard, it reminded him that it was worth it. He wasn't just providing for her, he was starting to care for her. Alexander sat in his study late into the night, the glow of his desk lamp casting long shadows across the walls. The neatly stacked documents before him weren't business contracts or investment reports, but legal paperwork, custody forms, character affidavits, and psychological assessments. The weight of what lay ahead pressed heavily on his shoulders. For the first time in years, Alexander felt unsure of his ability to control the outcome. A quiet knock at the door broke his thoughts. He glanced up, surprised to see Ella standing hesitantly in the doorway, clutching a blanket around her small frame. Her hair was slightly messy, and she looked younger than usual, like a child caught between a nightmare and reality. "Can't sleep?" he asked gently. Ella shook her head and stepped into the room. She didn't say anything, but her eyes wandered over the papers on his desk. She frowned, then looked back at him. "Is that about me?" Alexander hesitated. "Yes," he admitted, his tone soft. "I'm trying to make sure you can stay here." Ella tightened her grip on the blanket. Is it going to work? He wanted to promise her that it would. But the truth was, he didn't know. "I'm going to do everything I can," he said instead. "That's a promise." She nodded, though her expression remained wary. "Can I stay here with you? Just for a bit?" Alexander gestured to the chair across from him. "Of course." Ella curled up in the chair, the blanket draped around her like a cocoon. She didn't say anything more, and soon her breathing grew even, signaling she had drifted off. Alexander watched her for a moment, the vulnerability in her small frame striking a deep chord within him. He leaned back in his chair, his thoughts wandering back to the one person he had failed long ago, his sister. The next day, Alexander found himself walking through the overgrown paths of an old cemetery. He hadn't visited his sister's grave in years, not because he didn't care, but because the memories were too painful. Her name was etched in stone. Emily Hale, beloved sister and daughter, along with dates that marked a life far too short. He crouched down, brushing away some fallen leaves from the base of the headstone. "Hey, Emily," he murmured, his voice low and filled with regret. "It's been a while." The silence around him was deafening, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Alexander let out a heavy sigh, his hands resting on his knees. "You'd probably laugh at me if you saw me now," he said, a faint bitter smile tugging at his lips. "A millionaire who doesn't know the first thing about taking care of a kid. You were always better at this kind of thing." His mind flashed back to the last time he had seen her, pale and fragile in a hospital bed. He had been too young to understand the gravity of what was happening then, but he remembered the way she had held his hand, her fingers cold but steady. She had asked him to look after their parents, but she hadn't needed to say it. Her absence had left a hole in their family that no amount of time could fill. "I couldn't save you," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "but I can save her. I have to." He stayed there for a while, lost in memories and unspoken promises. When he finally stood, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Ella was his second chance, not to replace Emily, but to honor her. He wouldn't fail this time. Back at the mansion, Ella was sitting at the piano, her fingers moving over the keys in a slow, contemplative melody. Alexander paused in the doorway, listening quietly. When she noticed him, she stopped abruptly, her hands falling to her lap. "Sorry," she said quickly, "I didn't hear you come in." "No need to apologize," Alexander said, stepping into the room. "That was beautiful. Did you come up with it yourself?" Ella nodded. though she looked embarrassed. "I was just messing around." "Well, you're good at it," he said, sitting down on the edge of the couch. "Have you ever thought about taking lessons?" She blinked, surprised by the question. "Lessons, like with a real teacher?" "Why not?" Alexander asked. "You clearly have talent. It might be nice to learn more." Ella hesitated, then shrugged. "I don't know. It's just something I did with my mom. It's not important." Alexander leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "It seems important to you. And if it's important to you, it's important to me." For a moment, Ella didn't respond. Then, for the first time, she smiled. A real smile, small but genuine. "Maybe," she said softly. "I'll think about it." Alexander nodded, content with her answer. He didn't want to push her, not when she was finally starting to open up. "Take your time," he said. "There's no rush." As the evening settled in, Alexander couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. The challenges ahead were daunting, but for the first time, he felt like they could get through them together. Ella wasn't just a responsibility anymore. She was family, even if neither of them had said it out loud yet. Later that night, as he lay in bed, Alexander stared at the ceiling, his thoughts drifting back to Emily's grave. He thought about the promise he had made there, to himself, to her, to Ella. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't fail her. Not this time. The courtroom was both imposing and sterile, with its polished wood benches and high ceilings that seemed designed to intimidate. Alexander sat at the table with his lawyer, his usually confident posture slightly stiff. He wasn't a stranger to legal proceedings. He'd faced boardrooms and contract negotiations that could make grown men quake. But this was different. This wasn't about business or money. This was about Ella. Ella sat beside him, her small frame dwarfed by the oversized chair. She wore the new coat Alexander had bought her, but it didn't make her look any less vulnerable. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the floor. Every so often, she would glance at Alexander as if looking for reassurance. The opposing side, a state-appointed representative for the Department of Child Welfare, began their case. Margaret Ellis, the social worker who had visited Alexander, sat with them, her face calm but serious. She gave Alexander a brief, almost apologetic glance before looking away. The judge, a grey-haired woman with sharp eyes, began the proceedings. "Mr. Hale, you've petitioned for temporary custody of Ella Brooks. Given that you are not related to her by blood or legal ties, this court will need to assess your ability to provide a stable and nurturing environment for her. Let's begin." Alexander's lawyer stood, presenting their case with precision. He spoke about Alexander's resources, his ability to provide for Ella financially, and the steps he had already taken to ensure her well-being. But as the lawyer listed Alexander's accomplishments, Alexander couldn't help but feel that they sounded hollow. Money wasn't what Ella needed most. Then came the questioning. The opposing counsel stood, a sharp-faced woman with an air of confidence that grated on Alexander's nerves. "Mr. Hale," she began, her tone clipped, "can you explain what qualifies you to care for a child like Ella? You have no experience with children, correct?" Alexander took a breath, steadying himself. "That's true," he admitted, "but I'm learning. And I'm committed to giving her the stability and care she deserves." The lawyer raised an eyebrow. "Learning, you say? Do you think learning on the job is sufficient when it comes to raising a child who has just lost her mother?" Alexander's jaw tightened. "No one is ever fully prepared for something like this, but I'm doing everything in my power to make sure Ella feels safe and supported." The lawyer pressed on. "Your schedule as a businessman is undoubtedly demanding. How do you plan to balance that with the responsibilities of raising a child?" Alexander hesitated for a moment. "I've already started restructuring my schedule," he said firmly. "Ella comes first now." The questioning continued, each question feeling like a jab at his ability to be what Ella needed. But Alexander held his ground, determined to prove his commitment. Finally, the social worker, Margaret Ellis, was called to the stand. She spoke about her observations, noting that while Alexander's home was undoubtedly comfortable, his lack of parenting experience was a concern. However, she also acknowledged his clear dedication to Ella and the progress she had seen in their dynamic. Then it was Ella's turn, and it was. The judge leaned forward slightly, her voice softening. "Ella, would you like to say anything about your time with Mr. Hale?" Ella looked up, her wide eyes filled with apprehension. Alexander gave her a small nod, his expression encouraging. She stood slowly, the courtroom seeming to grow quieter as everyone focused on her. "I don't know much about what's supposed to happen here," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "but I know what it feels like to be alone, and I'm not alone anymore." She glanced at Alexander, her eyes shining with emotion. "Mr. Hale, Alexander, he didn't have to help me, but he did. He made sure I had a place to stay, clothes to wear, and food to eat. He listens to me. He cares." Her voice broke slightly, but she continued. "He's the first person who made me feel safe since my mom." She wiped at her eyes, but her voice grew stronger. "I don't want to go anywhere else. I want to stay with him." The room was silent. Even the opposing counsel seemed taken aback by her heartfelt words. Alexander felt his chest tighten, a lump forming in his throat. He hadn't realized just how much his actions had meant to her until now. The judge leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "Thank you, Ella," she said gently. She said, "You may sit down." Ella returned to her seat, her small hand brushing against Alexander's as she sat. He gave her a reassuring squeeze, though he could feel his own nerves fraying as they waited for the judge's decision. After what felt like an eternity, the judge spoke. "This court recognizes the extraordinary circumstances of this case. While Mr. Hale does not have prior parenting experience, it is evident that he has shown dedication and care for Ella Brooks. Therefore, I am granting Mr. Hale temporary custody with a review in 6 months to assess the arrangement's progress." Relief flooded through Alexander, though he kept his composure. Beside him, Ella let out a shaky breath, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in days. The judge continued, outlining the conditions of the custody arrangement, but Alexander barely heard the details. All that mattered was that Ella was staying with him. As they left the courtroom, Ella looked up at him, her expression a mix of exhaustion and hope. "You meant it," she said quietly, "when you said you wouldn't let anyone take me." "I meant every word," Alexander replied, his voice steady, "and I always will." For the first time, Ella reached out and took his hand as they walked. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. Alexander knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, he felt like they were facing it together. The drive back to the mansion was quiet, the weight of the courtroom still lingering in the air. Ella sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window. She clutched the small stuffed animal Alexander had bought her earlier that week, her fingers gripping it tightly, though she said nothing. Alexander glanced at her a few times, but he didn't push her to speak. He knew she needed time to process. When they pulled into the driveway, the gates closed behind them with a soft hum, sealing them back into the quiet sanctuary of the estate. Ella stepped out of the car and followed Alexander inside, her small frame moving with a mix of exhaustion and relief. "You hungry?" Alexander asked as he hung up his coat. Ella shrugged. "Maybe a little." "Come on," he said, nodding toward the kitchen. "Let's see what we can put together." In the kitchen, Alexander rummaged through the refrigerator, pulling out bread, cheese, and a few other ingredients. "How about grilled cheese?" he asked, glancing at her. Ella raised an eyebrow. "You know how to make grilled cheese?" Alexander smirked. "I'm not completely useless in the kitchen. Watch and learn." He set to work, heating a pan and buttering the bread with an efficiency that surprised even himself. Ella sat at the counter, resting her chin on her hand as she watched. For the first time in what felt like days, Her expression softened. "You don't have to do all this, you know," she said quietly. Alexander paused. "Alexander," turning to face her. "Do what?" "Take care of me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You could have just let them take me." He set down the spatula and leaned against the counter, his gaze steady. "Ella, I didn't just help you because I felt like I had to. I helped you because I wanted to. You deserve to feel safe. You deserve to have someone who cares about you." She looked down at her hands, fiddling with the ears of the stuffed animal. "I'm not used to it," she admitted. "Having someone care." "Well, get used to it," Alexander said gently, "because I'm not going anywhere." Ella didn't respond, but when he turned back to the stove, he caught a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. Over the next few weeks, life began to settle into a new rhythm. The house, once cold and empty, started to feel more like a home. Alexander made small changes, adding touches of color to the rooms, replacing some of the sterile furniture with softer, more inviting pieces. He even transformed one of the spare bedrooms into a music room for Ella, complete with her keyboard, shelves for books, and a cozy chair by the window. Ella spent hours in the music room, her confidence on the keyboard growing with each passing day. Alexander often found himself lingering in the doorway, listening to her play. The melodies she created were filled with emotion, sometimes light and playful, other times haunting and deep. It was as if she poured her heart into every note, using the music to express what words couldn't. One evening, as she played a particularly moving piece, Alexander stepped inside and sat in the chair by the window. When she finished, she turned to him, her cheeks slightly flushed. "What do you think?" she asked. "I think you're amazing," he said honestly. "You know, I've been looking into some programs. There's a school in the city, an art school. They have a music program. If you're interested, I could help you apply." Ella's eyes widened. "You mean like real music school?" "Why not?" Alexander said with a shrug. "You've got the talent. You just need someone to help you take it further." She hesitated, her excitement dimming slightly. "What if I'm not good enough?" Alexander leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Ella, you've been through more than most people ever will, and you're still here. You're still playing, still creating. That takes strength. If you want this, I'll do whatever it takes to help you succeed. But it's your choice." Ella bit her lip, her gaze dropping to the keyboard. After a moment she nodded. "Okay, I'll try." One afternoon, as Alexander worked in his study, his phone buzzed. It was Margaret Ellis, the social worker. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Mr. Hale," Margaret said, her tone professional but not unkind. "I wanted to follow up on the custody arrangement. How are things going?" "They're going well," Alexander replied. "Ella's adjusting. I think she's starting to feel more at home." "That's good to hear," Margaret said. "I'll need to schedule a home visit in the next month, just to check in and see how she's doing." "Of course," Alexander said, though the thought of being scrutinized again made his chest tighten. "We'll be ready." "Thank you, Mr. Hale," Margaret said. "And I just want to say, I've seen a lot of cases like this. Not all of them turn out well, but I can tell you care about her. That makes a difference." After the call ended, Alexander sat back in his chair, staring at the papers on his desk. The battle for Ella wasn't over. The 6-month review loomed in the back of his mind, a constant reminder that their time together wasn't guaranteed. But he pushed the thought aside. For now, all that mattered was making sure Ella felt secure and loved. That evening, as they sat in the living room, Ella turned to Alexander. "Do you think my mom would be proud of me?" The question caught him off guard. He looked at her, seeing the vulnerability in her eyes. "I think she'd be incredibly proud," he said. "Of your strength, your talent, and the way you keep going no matter what." Ella nodded, her gaze distant. "I hope so." Alexander placed a hand on her shoulder. "I know so." For the first time she leaned into him, resting her head against his arm. In that moment, Alexander felt something he hadn't in years, a sense of purpose that went beyond money, beyond success. Ella wasn't just someone he was helping, she was family. The days began to blend into weeks, and the mansion slowly transformed from a pristine monument to Alexander's success into a warm, lived-in home. The once silent hallways now echoed with Ella's footsteps and the melodies she played on her keyboard. Small changes, like colorful throw pillows, a puzzle spread out on the coffee table, and sketches Ella taped to the fridge, gave the space a sense of life it had never had before. One morning, Alexander stood in the kitchen, flipping pancakes, a skill he had quickly picked up after Ella's unfiltered critique of his earlier breakfast attempts. Ella sat at the counter, her hair still messy from sleep, watching him with mild amusement. "You're getting better," she said, smirking. "Better?" Alexander scoffed, pretending to be offended. "These are practically gourmet." Ella shrugged, her smirk widening. "We'll see," as he slid a pancake onto her plate. Alexander couldn't help but smile. Moments like these, small and ordinary, had become the highlights of his day. He had spent years chasing milestones, always striving for the next achievement. But now, the simple act of making breakfast for Ella felt like the most meaningful thing he'd ever done. "Do you have plans for today?" he asked, pouring more batter into the pan. Ella nodded, chewing thoughtfully. "I want to work on that song for the school application. You know, the one I started last week." Alexander turned, raising an eyebrow. "The one you won't let me hear?" "It's not ready," Ella said quickly, a faint blush creeping into her cheeks. "You'll hear it when it's good." "It's probably already good," Alexander said, flipping the pancake. "But I'll wait. No pressure." Ella gave him a small, grateful smile, and they continued their breakfast in comfortable silence. That afternoon, Alexander's lawyer stopped by with updates about the custody case. They sat in the study, the usual clutter of legal papers spread across the desk. Ella had retreated to her music room, giving them space to talk. "The 6-month review is approaching," the lawyer began, adjusting his glasses. "You've made significant progress, but you'll need to demonstrate continued growth. The judge will want to see that Ella is thriving here, emotionally, socially, and academically." "She is," Alexander said firmly. "She's doing better than I ever expected." "That's good," the lawyer replied, his tone cautious. "But it wouldn't hurt to have something concrete to show. Evidence that you've been proactive about her development."